Thanks for joining us, everyone. Thank you, Julian, as well. Julian is our research director, by the way. My name's Alexander Meleagrou-Hitchens. I'm the co-director of the International Center to Study Radicalisation, where we run the GNET project with support from GIFCT. And I'm joined here by the executive director of GIFCT, Naureen Chowdhury Fink, who's been working in this area in the wider security field for a very long time. You may know her from her time at the Soufan Center, also the UK mission for the United Nations as well. So Julian's talked to you a little bit about GNET, and most of you will be fairly well aware of what we do, but we wanted to take a bit of time here to discuss sort of the wider work of GIFCT and introduce some of you to it if you're not familiar with it and what it does. So I guess we can start off with just a quick, perhaps, overview from you, Naureen, about what GIFCT is, what it does, how it does what it does.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. And it is wonderful to be back here. I'm a former King's alum, War Studies in the house. So it's great to be here. And I want to start actually by also thanking GNET. It's been wonderful to work with Julianne Bell, the team, yourself. And so it's wonderful to be here. And this is, I think, my first time in person at the conference. So this is a great place to tell you a little bit about what GIFCT is, for those of you who don't know us. We are, in fact, an independent nonprofit organization. We were established initially by 4 founding members at the time: Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, and YouTube, and have evolved into an independent NGO with over 30 tech member platforms that we work with now. We also are very unique in being a tech-led multi-stakeholder community. So we work very closely with an independent advisory committee that is made up of member states and civil society, and they work with our tech-led operating board and ourselves. And many of you may know we have a number of multi-stakeholder working groups. So we are a nonprofit sector that kind of straddles 3 tectonic plates of policy, industry, and practice, and it's really exciting to be here.
Thank you. There's a couple of initiatives I know that you're running to try to help both your members, but also policymakers and governments in terms of responding to incidents, but also identifying materials and removing them rapidly and sort of efficiently. I think you have the incident response initiative and also the hash sharing database. I think those were 2 that are particularly interesting, useful things to kind of expand on a little bit.
Sure. Let me put a little bit into context when you mentioned those tools and tell you a little bit about how we work, and then I'll come to those initiatives. We operate through about 4 key tools, and one of them is we create a community of information sharing, knowledge exchange, and practice among our platforms. So that means it's an intra-industry membership community. We work closely with them. We provide information and support, so that's one. The second is our hash sharing, and it's in no particular order, but the hash sharing database, the incident response framework, and of course, the 4th key tool is why we're here today, research and analysis. And this is why we invest in GNET. For us, it's really important to make sure that our member platforms have access to global expertise, experts, and perspectives so that they can, in fact, identify and understand the content on their platforms and think about how to address them within their own terms of service and within their own policies. So my first point of clarification, if I may a little, is that we don't actually remove content. Our work is to work with our member platforms and make sure they understand what kind of harms we may be seeing, we may be hearing about from our stakeholder companies, and then they action it according to their own terms of service and their policies. Some of you may have heard about our incident response framework. It's what allows us to understand when there is an offline incident, because we know that what happens in real life shapes also what happens online and vice versa. If there's an offline incident, we activate our incident response framework to deal with the online dimensions of it. We have a fairly strict criteria and different types of activations. But our job is to make sure that our member platforms can better identify and understand the online components of an offline event. So we have activations that allow hash labels to be developed, that allow for members to speak to each other about specific incidents, helps raise awareness. And actually, when you look at our membership, it's a really diverse group, right? Not every community and every company, sorry, looks the same. We have everything from the big to small and everything in between. So the incident response framework also creates a space where our members can work with each other and learn from each other what they are seeing and what kinds of tools they may be using to respond to them.
And on the hash sharing database, could you give us a bit more detail on how that works? I mean, what it refers to? Some people may not be aware, for example, even what hashing
Absolutely.
means.
I can do the top line, and then I'm sure I'll have to talk to people in the team to give you more technical detail. But no, a hash is a digital fingerprint that can be assigned to online content, so that instead of resharing the content or resharing associated information, you can simply share the digital fingerprint or the hash, and that allows companies to match it through a matching system, which beautifully named Hasher, Matcher, Actioner. And thanks, guys. And so the fingerprinting, so to speak, of that content means that it can be identified, matched, reshared, and information about it circulated.
Thanks. And also, I think one other thing worth talking about or mentioning is another project that we're running here, which is the repository of extremist aligned documents, the READ database, which was initially backed and is still backed by the Canadian government, but has also now received support from GIFCT. And actually, this might be useful for those of you researchers and students in the audience and online. Essentially, it is a primary source repository, particularly for right-wing extremist materials. So things like manifestos, but also other primary sources that, while you can still access them online and other places, often requires you to be quite deeply involved in the sort of online ecosystem of the extreme right. And that may be something that either you're not, because you don't know how to access those things, or you don't want to be sifting through them. Either way, we've created this system. It's a subscriber based. It's not, there's no charge, there's no fee, but it requires you to have a good reason to need to access these documents, research, or government work. And we'll have a couple thousand documents up and available for subscribers in the coming weeks. And also, in some cases, we'll also be providing analysis of those documents. So the goal here is to kind of equip researchers, but also people within GIFCT with the ability to access and understand these materials as they need them. And so we also want to say thank you for your support for that. And you'll be hearing a bit more about that from Julian, who's running that as well later in the day. As I said, the website itself will be up and running in the coming weeks. So as far as you mentioned, you're essentially working with these different major companies and also smaller ones. And of course, all these companies have their own ways of working, their own internal regulations and rules, policies. So how does GIFCT, where does it fit in terms of how does it influence policy, practice of this, very diverse and often, interchangeable or sometimes disagreeing companies?
That's a great question. I hope we influence the policies and practice of our members, but I think there are two main ways of thinking about it. One would be we provide information and support. And so we can't tell them what to do, but we can suggest that this is the information perhaps on which they'd like to base some of their decisions or to consider the different aspects of what we're hearing. And as I said, multi-stakeholder engagement is really a key way of working for GIFCT. So it also allows us to channel inputs from civil society, academia, governments, law enforcement, all the kind of good practice and knowledge that we are hearing about how to address these threats. We can bring them into education, insight, and support. This is also where GNET fits in and is so key to us, those insights and reports that are published. So that's one way we hope we can shape the way that our members are thinking about what they need to do. But I would say the other way is our criteria in itself. We do have a membership process. So companies come to us or we go to them and, you have that first date, you have a coffee, see if you get along, and then you take it to the next step. And then for us, that is our membership criteria. And we have a membership advisory program where we work with companies, some of whom may actually, have to do a little bit of work to be able to meet that criteria. There are areas like transparency, human rights, working with civil society, which might not always be inherent for tech companies to be thinking about. And so that's one way we also hope that we shape this community of practice, because by subscribing and kind of reinforcing our membership criteria, they're choosing to join a community of industry members and kind of make a certain pledge. So I think that's also one way we hope to shape how they interact.
Great. And also, yeah, the way GNET fits into that is sometimes members, some of the less experienced ones, need some background information on a topic that has just emerged for them. We're there to kind of react quite quickly and provide analysis. We usually draw from our pool of contributors and experts to try to do that quickly, efficiently. So we're very glad to be able to do that.
I would add that some of our more experienced members also greatly appreciate those, and we've had tremendous feedback from our members about those bespoke resources. So thank you, GNET.
So this is our 5th annual conference. Last year covered a range of topics, of course, AI, cryptocurrency, hard tech, things like 3D printed weapons, drones. So I wondered, in the years since, what is your sense of the kind of biggest challenges the tech sector has faced, your partners have faced in this space of the use of their technology, both their online platforms, perhaps also other forms of technology they produce by extremists and terrorists? Has there been other kind of a couple of things worth pointing out over the last year, or has it been a sort of continuation of the things that we were covering last year?
I think it's a bit of both. I think 2 or 3 points really stand out to me. It's always hard to predict the future, but I think that I'd say blurred lines or blurred boundaries in some ways, like understanding what content is violative and difficult. And I say that because, we often talk about this internally and with many of our colleagues, that there was an era where, designated terrorist groups like to brand their material. It was a point of pride to have their logo on material or to speak as a member of the group. And, with sanctions regimes and designations and whatnot, in many ways, it was easier to identify and determine what that content was. Now we have perpetrators with either, blended motives, as I don't know if I can call it that, blended motives that are kind of taking bits from different groups or coming up with their own combination. So you don't have that clear affiliation with a legal regime or in an international framework that has been agreed upon. And I think that is quite difficult to manage, because the whole reason it's a difficult framework that has taken 2 decades of policymaking is there is so much diversity and kind of a chasm between where countries and states determine definitions and designations. And that also means that, there is more of a question of borderline content, right? Whether it's content related to conflicts that are ongoing, and the more conflicts we see and the more these become intractable all around the world, the more I think we will see content that is difficult to delineate and where the boundaries may be difficult. And then the third point I would say is youth. If the users and certainly here in the UK, we've seen quite young convictions of terrorist offenders. And so if we are talking about younger and younger people, well, maybe many of the counterterrorism practices and regimes are dealing with older folks. So how do we deal with youth and minors? And I think that is something to really, I know the companies face this on a number of levels, counterterrorism, communities, we're all facing this. But I think that will be a key challenge.
And you mentioned about sort of states having their own designations there. How do you kind of deal with that challenge of sort of waiting for the designations of states, doing your own designations? Do you know if companies as well take the lead from states in terms of doing that? Do they have to ignore that and develop their own ways of understanding and defining terrorists, extremists?
Well, it's a bit of a mix for individual companies, and I'll let some of them speak for themselves if they need to on their own list. But I think for us, one starting point was the UN's counterterrorism sanctions list, which is ISIL, Al-Qaeda. It's known as the 1267 sanctions list. But that is one. We also have behavioral indicators. So it's a mix of it for GIFCT, it's a mix of the UN sanctions list, as well as behavioral indicators that might trigger content or activations of the incident response framework. So we're not limited by the sanctions list, but that is one basis for how we work. I think for many companies, it will be about the country or the region that they're based in will be, I think, one criteria, but I know many also develop their own lists of dangerous individuals and organizations.
Yeah, and these sort of, you mentioned this sort of distinguishing terrorist, borderline content. So kind of recent examples you could think of, Palm Springs, attack on the fertility clinic there by a person who subscribed to something called Ifalism, sort of anti-life ideology. It's been around for a bit. Or even sort of incels, these slightly more idiosyncratic, not clearly terrorist ideologies, but are still managing to have some role in motivating people to commit acts of violence. How do you deal with that? I mean, now that you've had this incident in Palm Springs, say, how do you start considering whether or not to start looking more closely at the output of people like that?
I think for us, first of all, we did activate our incident response framework in response to Palm Springs. And so I think, again, it comes down to the behaviors and the actions. There was enough there that met the criteria for our incident response framework. And so we did activate for that one. And that's why I think it's a mix of sort of ideology and those frameworks and then actual behaviors. And there are behaviors that meet the criteria for content within our incident response framework. Just being a bit of a UN nerd, I will also just go back and say that there is a lot of convergence about definitions and elements of terrorist acts. So there's sometimes less divergence than we think there is, because there are a lot of agreements about what terrorist acts constitute. But in our case, Palm Springs did activate the incident response framework. We had one last year in Eskişehir, we had one in Volgograd. So for us, there's a lot of the sort of expanded inclusion criteria for our hash sharing database really takes into account some of these aspects.
And I guess just as we come near the end here, sort of looking ahead next 1 to 5 years, I know it's hard to, as you said, predict much, but if you were to kind of have to develop a working paper on what your team needs to worry about or should be thinking about in the coming years. I think you touched on a couple of those already. Have you got anything that's maybe also not immediately obvious to us, or is it kind of the things we may expect?
I mean, the couple of things that keep me up at night, I think, is a continuation of the youth aspect, because we know that users are getting younger, and what we would call that period of radicalization or mobilization is becoming increasingly condensed, right? So we could have, previously you'd have a few years to monitor someone who might be behaving differently or that you're worried about, but now you've sometimes got days or weeks. And if they're younger and younger, that space is going to condense with the kind of influences that are there. So how does a responsive community, whether in terms of developing a prevention framework, and be interesting to hear from folks in Prevent how that works, but also from kind of a community counterterrorism, law enforcement, child safety aspect, how do you respond in time? That I think is something very worrying. I would also say autonomous weapons, right? That as autonomous weapons, we've seen, for example, drones. I think in East Africa, it's largely been reconnaissance at this point. It's largely been photography. Once those become combat weapons, then how do we manage these kind of the use of autonomous weapons when we've talked about trends like 3D printing or kind of having all that information online for someone to develop it themselves? So between the youth and the autonomous weapons, I think are two things that we're going to see very quickly.
Okay. Well, I think that's actually a good place to end it, because our next panel is going to be looking at the emerging technology. So thank you again, Naureen. We have about 5-10 minutes to set up the next panel, and see you in a bit.
Thank you very much. Thanks.